August 4th, 1943, Norfolk, Virginia. The first breath of America hit Wilhelm Krause long before he ever set foot on the pier. The early morning wind carried the sharp salt of the sea, mixed with a faint trace of engine oil from the cranes groaning overhead, blended with the smell of fresh bread drifting from some small dockside bakery. A whisper of smoked meat, bacon, slid past like a ghost, making his stomach clench in reflex. Beneath it all lingered the harsh scent of disinfectant from the ship's hold where they had been kept, still clinging to their torn shirts and the brittle strips of dried sweat on their necks. The Liberty ship groaned, like an old beast exhaling its last tired breath. Metal scraped against metal, ropes tightened and rubbed against the harbor posts, and the tide slapped gently against the hull. Hundreds of German POWs stood shoulder to shoulder on the deck, uniforms worn thin like rags, faces blackened with soot, eyes hollowed by the sea and by war. They stepped slowly down the metal stairs, each clank, clank, clank of their boots echoing into the cold, pale dawn. Inside Wilhelm's head, German slogans repeated themselves like grinding gears. America is barbaric. They will break you. Better dead than captured. He gripped the icy railing, feeling the damp metal grain pressing into his skin. Each step down slowed under the weight of the fear he had carried for months. But then, he heard something impossibly wrong. Laughter. Real laughter. Down on the pier, American soldiers stood in small groups. One flicked open a Zippo. The sharp click cut through the humid air. Another chewed a sandwich, the smell of cold cuts and soft bread rising faintly with the breeze. Somewhere in the neighborhood beyond the harbor came the sound of children playing baseball, the crack of wood against a ball, little bursts of cheering. Wilhelm held his breath. Impossible. In his imagination, America was supposed to be a skeleton port, barren, ruined, wind-scoured. But before him were white church steeples catching the new sunlight, neat rooftops still intact, freshly painted trucks rolling slowly along the road. Live oaks cast long shadows over the street leading into the city, their leaves trembling softly in the morning wind. The Americans were not cruel as propaganda had sworn. They were not seething with hatred. One MP even lifted a cup of coffee, sipped, and smiled as the prisoners passed. Wilhelm felt his heartbeat stutter, as if everything he believed had begun to crack. An MP walked toward him. Wilhelm tightened his shoulders, bracing for the rifle butt, the kick, the insults, the barbarity he had been taught to expect from Munich to the Africa Corps. But the American simply spoke, calm as someone guiding a ship to shore. Single file, gentlemen, this way. No shouting, no degrading words, not even a hint of treating them like animals. Wilhelm stopped for a single second. Just one, long enough to see the first sunlight land on the line of barbed wire freshly strung a few dozen meters ahead. The light caught on each metal barb like silver droplets. A sight so strangely beautiful, it stole his breath. This was not the America he had been told about, not the enemy he had been raised to hate. And as he inhaled again, smelling bacon, fresh bread, and the salt wind soaking into his skin, Wilhelm understood the source of his trembling. America was not behaving like a ruthless victor. It was behaving like a place he had never imagined could exist at all. The American military truck growled awake, shuddering like a beast rising from sleep, then slowly rolled away from the Norfolk pier. Wilhelm Krause pressed himself against the wooden wall of the truck bed, arms wrapped around his knees, trying to keep his breaths as small as possible, as if breathing too loudly would earn him an American rifle butt to the face. But no one did any such thing. Inside the truck, the air was filled with clashing scents, the hot iron smell of the truck bed, the lingering sea salt clinging to the prisoner's clothes, the sour sweat of days trapped below the hold. And then, slicing through all expectations like a blade, the smell of bacon and soft bread. Wilhelm lifted his head, eyes darting, The American soldiers on the front bench were eating breakfast. One of them tore open a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. A tiny motion, nothing more, but the smell of cold cuts, butter, warm bread flooded the cramped space, tightening Wilhelm's stomach like a pulled wire. He heard them taking bites, crunch, chew, swallow, completely relaxed, as if out on a picnic instead of escorting the enemy. In Germany, we ate black bread so hard it cut your gums. In America, even their breakfast smells like a holiday. He tried to turn his face away, but the scent of meat clung to him, taunting. A train whistle cried somewhere in the city, long, high, rising over the morning air, mixing with the sound of birds. Those sounds were strange, soft, peaceful, without the jagged edges of a nation at war. Wilhelm had seen rubble for years across Europe, but as the truck rumbled across Norfolk's cobblestone streets, he saw intact homes, white steeples peeking above rooftops and the broad shadows of live oaks swaying gently over wooden porches. This was not the ruined, starving country German newspapers had described, and that unsettled Wilhelm more than anything else. The steel slats of the truck rattled with every pothole, knocking the prisoners into one another. Wilhelm squeezed his knees tighter. The wood beneath his palm was rough, warm, and dry. Nothing like the damp, moldy boards of German army wagons. Every small detail set him further on edge. Everything was too clean, too orderly, too normal. An American MP glanced over his shoulder at them. Wilhelm's head dropped instantly, cheeks burning. He braced for a shout, but the soldier simply asked his buddy, "Hey, you want the last one? Bacon's still warm." Wilhelm heard the crackle of wax paper as the sandwich was passed forward. No one looked at the prisoners. No one guarded them nervously. No one treated them like a threat. Why? Wilhelm swallowed hard. His mind split in two. One part clinging to propaganda, the idea that Americans were pretending kindness before the cruelty began. The other, a rising, terrifying suspicion that perhaps he had been lied to for years. The road out of the city widened, lined with rows of green trees. The smell of the sea faded, replaced by the damp earth of the American southeast. A soft breeze slipped through a crack in the truck bed, carrying the faint smell of flour from a bakery by the roadside. In Europe, those smells always came with death and ruin. Here, they came with life. The truck braked at a stoplight. From the neighborhood nearby, Wilhelm heard kids playing, the thump of a ball, bright laughter, parents calling their children in for breakfast. The sound pierced him like a needle. The war had ravaged Europe like a plague, but here, America seemed healthy. Why aren't they suffering? Why aren't they starving like we were told? Why does everything look alive? Wilhelm couldn't stand the feeling, the sense of betrayal by the beliefs he once held as truth. The truck drove nearly another hour, its tires hissing across the dry road like fabric being cut. Every sound etched itself into Wilhelm's mind. The guards laughing, the smoother American engine, the rustle of American jackets, a Zippo flicking open again. Click. He smelled clean cotton from the Americans' uniforms, mixed with Virginia tobacco. Just a few feet of space, but enough for Wilhelm to feel the stabbing contrast. In Germany, soldiers smelled of sweat, coal dust, and gunpowder. In America, the guards smelled of soap and fresh cotton. The truck fell into a heavy silence as the prisoners began to understand one thing. No one knew what awaited them at the camp, but everything since stepping onto American soil had defied all imagination. Wilhelm closed his eyes and leaned his head against the wooden wall. One single thought rose from the depths of his mind. If the lies were this big, what else don't I know about America? The truck lurched gently, then came to a full stop before a tall iron gate. Wilhelm felt the hiss of the hinges travel through the air like an omen of something terrible. He knew that sound too well. The sound of camp gates, usually followed by barking orders, boots slamming the ground, and the dread of having the last scraps of one's humanity stripped away. When the American soldiers tapped the side of the truck and ordered them out, Wilhelm moved in a half-dazed state, heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. But the first thing that hit him when his boots touched the ground was not hostility. It was the smell of food. A wave of warm air carried the scent of fried chicken, fresh bread, and melting butter straight into Wilhelm's face. It struck him so hard he stumbled for a second. In German barracks, good food was for officers only. In European POW camps, prisoners were fed black bread and watery soup. But here in America, why did a prison camp smell like a family kitchen? He looked around. Rows of white-painted wooden barracks, clean windows, new tin roofs. No damp darkness, no rotting trenches, no stench of death. Only the smell of pine wood, morning earth, and the soft warmth drifting out from the kitchen across the yard. The American soldiers nearby didn't look at them like enemies. One was writing on a clipboard while joking with his buddy, the two of them laughing openly. No one glared. No one gripped their rifles like they were waiting for an excuse to strike. A black MP smiled when he saw the prisoner's confusion. Wilhelm instantly lowered his gaze, afraid to return the expression. He still believed any wrong move could bring punishment. But no punishment came. One of the soldiers pointed toward a long building. "Straight inside. Breakfast is almost ready." Breakfast. The word alone nearly made Wilhelm laugh. If his throat hadn't been so dry that no sound came out. When he stepped into the mess hall, his heartbeat slowed. Long wooden tables, a spotless floor, natural light pouring in, the faint trace of disinfectant still lingering in the air. It looked more like a training barracks than a place meant to detain dangerous enemies. And in the middle of the room, great steaming trays of food, golden fried chicken, mashed potatoes, warm biscuits, and strong black coffee. The German prisoners around Wilhelm stood frozen, unsure how to take the next step. Some looked down at their feet, convinced this was psychological warfare. An American cook, hair silver at the temples, looked at Wilhelm and nodded a greeting. No disdain, no hatred, just a gesture from one human being to another. Then he gently placed a tray into Wilhelm's hands, as if offering something more important than food. A quiet acknowledgement that Wilhelm still had worth. "Eat it before it gets cold," he said. The words hit Wilhelm like a blow to the chest. Simple, but they shattered the shell propaganda had built around him. In Germany, prisoners were shouted at even when stepping into line. Here, the cook called him son. Wilhelm looked down at the hot food on his tray. Steam rose up, warming his face. The rich smell of meat, the softness of the bread. It all collided with memories of months of hunger, nights gnawing at stale black bread until his gums bled. He wanted to eat immediately, but his hands trembled, not from hunger, but from disbelief that any of this could be real. A whisper came from the prisoner beside him. "The Americans are really feeding us?" Wilhelm couldn't answer. He simply walked to the long table, set his tray down, and took a seat on a wooden chair so clean he hesitated to rest his hands on it. No shouting, no heads slammed down, no fists pounding the table. For one moment, just a single, fragile second, Wilhelm felt like a human being again, not a piece of war debris exchanged and discarded. When he lifted his fork, the smell of hot fried chicken rose once more. And the moment that scent touched his mind, he understood what was truly rising inside him. It wasn't the food that overwhelmed him. It wasn't the cleanliness or the bright wooden barracks. It was the unearned kindness radiating from people he had been taught to hate. Standing at the gates of an American camp, Wilhelm realized the most terrifying truth of his first day on U.S. soil. America did not act like a ruthless victor. America acted like human beings. And that broke him more deeply than any weapon ever could. Night fell over the American POW camp faster than Wilhelm expected. The Virginia sky shifted from pale blue to deep violet, then sank into a gentle darkness. As the American guards led the prisoners toward the barracks, Wilhelm walked with the feeling that he was stepping into a trap woven from the kindness of daytime. Everything today had been too strange, too illogical, tightening him like a bowstring pulled to its limit. When the barracks door opened, Wilhelm froze. The sleeping quarters were wide, airy, lit with warm yellow lamps. A soft trace of laundry powder floated in the air, a scent he had never once smelled in any German barracks, where moldy blankets and damp straw were simply part of life. But what truly paralyzed him were the long rows of beds along both walls. Each bed had a real mattress, thick with a gentle give, covered by a thin white sheet, clean and crisp. A pillow sat neatly at the head of each bed, its seams intact, its surface unbroken. At the foot of every bed lay a light blue cotton blanket, folded as neatly as if by an American mother, not by prison guards. For 1 second, Wilhelm's mind went blank, so blank he thought he might faint. In Europe, German soldiers slept on straw or wooden planks hard as stone. Many nights they used their coats as padding just to avoid being bitten by lice. In Tunisia, Wilhelm had slept on ground so hot and dry it branded itself into his memory with dust and the smell of blood. And here, in an American prison camp, they were given real beds? A prisoner behind him muttered, "Will there be inspections in the morning? Or is this how they get us to drop our guard?" Wilhelm didn't answer. He couldn't. He stepped slowly toward the bed assigned to him and laid a hand on the mattress. It dipped under his touch, soft and springy, a luxury reserved only for Americans. The sensation was so overwhelming that heat rose under his skin. His fingertips tingled as if touching something forbidden. No, this couldn't be real. This wasn't a prison camp. This had to be a performance. It had to be. But when he sat down, the mattress shifted gently, supporting his whole body like a wordless friend. The clean cotton smell from the pillow made his throat tighten. It was a gentle smell, one that did not belong to war or fear. He closed his eyes, and that was when the fear hit. Not fear of the Americans. Fear of himself, beginning to trust them. In Munich, he had grown up on stories claiming America was chaotic, poor, violent. In the barracks, he was taught that American soldiers were weak, savage, dishonorable. In North Africa, officers insisted Americans treated POWs like animals. And yet today, American soldiers laughed. American soldiers didn't beat them. American soldiers fed them better than German soldiers fed their own. And now, American soldiers were giving them real beds to sleep on. If this is America, what have we been fighting? The question stabbed through his chest. A whisper rose somewhere across the room. "They'll take everything back in the morning. This is just a trick." Another voice replied, "No, I saw them cleaning the kitchen for tomorrow's breakfast." No one knew what to believe. Wilhelm lay down, the cool sheet pressed against his back like cold stream water. He startled and sat up instantly. The sensation of cleanliness frightened him, as if he didn't deserve it. He tried again, slower. The mattress embraced him. His muscles, for the first time in months, surrendered to softness. His whole body sank, not from fatigue, but because he no longer had the strength to stand against a kindness he could not comprehend. Outside the barracks, Virginia's night insects hummed, and the old live oaks rustled in the light wind. No gunshots, no screams, no boots marching in rhythm, only peaceful night, a peace so complete it made him uneasy. A small sound came from the next bed, another prisoner trembling, not from cold, but from emotional overload. Wilhelm understood. The fear wasn't of punishment or hunger. The fear came from realizing the Americans were nothing like the monsters Germany had painted. He pulled the blanket over himself and caught the faint smells of dry grass, laundry powder, and a hint of lemon cleanser. None of it belonged to war. None of it belonged to hatred. None of it belonged to the life he had known. And in that moment, Wilhelm realized the most shameful truth. He didn't know how to face kindness. On the battlefield, he knew how to face bullets. In the barracks, he knew how to endure hunger. In German prisons, he knew how to survive through fear. But in an American POW camp, when treated like a human being, he had no idea what to do with the emotions rising inside him. Before sinking into his first sleep on American soil, Wilhelm thought, "Kindness is the enemy I never learned to fight." And that night, he slept on the softest mattress he had ever touched, not because America wanted to humiliate him, but because that was simply how Americans treated people. Morning crept into the barracks quietly, as if even the light was afraid to disturb men whose entire world had been overturned by the kindness of their enemy the day before. Wilhelm Krause opened his eyes to an unfamiliar sensation. His back did not hurt. The sheet beneath him was cool and clean, carrying a faint scent of laundry powder. The pillow cradled his head, a luxury he had never had even in the German army. He lay still, trying to understand it. He couldn't. No one could. The door opened, a single set of footsteps. Then the smell of clean cotton and fresh pine drifted in. Wilhelm jerked upright, his heart tightening with the instinct of a survivor. He expected a morning inspection, a shouted order, the sudden reappearance of hatred, but the American who stepped inside carried books. No guns, no batons, just books. A prisoner whispered, "What do they want from us?" But no one had an answer. The American soldier walked down the row of beds, placing a thin brown-covered book on each one. Wilhelm recognized the scent from a distance. Paper. A peaceful smell in a world where war had stolen so many of his friends. When the book landed in front of him, Wilhelm saw two words he had never imagined he would see in a POW camp: Holy Bible. He froze, like a machine that had run out of fuel, like his mind had stepped into territory that simply didn't exist on the Reich's propaganda maps. The American soldier smiled, a slow, gentle smile with no shadow behind it. "Not to convert you," he said, "to give you peace." Peace. A simple word, but it struck Wilhelm like a stone tossed onto the frozen lake inside him. In the German barracks, they taught him about honor, about victory, about death. No one ever taught him about peace. The American sat down beside his bed. No force, no authority, just two men sitting together, as if the war outside this room did not exist. "Your mother back home," he said softly. "She probably prays for you. Ours do too." Wilhelm wanted to reject it, wanted to pull away, wanted to protect the armor the Reich had welded around him. But that simple sentence, so ordinary it was almost trivial, pierced him in a way bullets never had. Mothers. Germans had mothers. Americans had mothers, and every one of them worried for their sons, no matter which side of the battlefield those sons stood on. Wilhelm swallowed, but his throat tightened painfully. He couldn't look at the soldier any longer. If he did, even for one more second, he feared he would break. The American rested a hand lightly on the book. "Keep it," he said. "You'll need something that helps you sleep." Then he stood and moved on to the next bed, gentle, unhurried, as if walking through a classroom, not a prison. Wilhelm opened the book. The first page lifted with the scent of old paper, dust, and memories from homes that had never known bombs. Morning, light struck the line of text. "Blessed are the peacemakers." Wilhelm read it again, and again. Each word striking like a hammer against the stone walls German propaganda had built inside him. Last night he had lain awake because he couldn't believe the kindness. This morning, he lay awake because he didn't know how to face it. He had been prepared for hatred and found understanding. He had been prepared for punishment and received compassion. And sitting there with a Bible in his hands, Wilhelm realized a truth more frightening than any artillery barrage he had survived. Reich broke their bodies, but America was breaking something much deeper. He closed the book and exhaled, a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. and that led him to a conclusion none of them dared to say aloud. This quiet kindness was the weapon I was never trained to resist. Wilhelm was still sitting there, his hand resting on the Bible as the footsteps of the American soldier faded toward the far end of the barracks. Morning light crawled slowly across the wooden floor, touching the edge of his blanket, touching his worn boots, touching even the confusion growing steadily inside him. And in that moment, with the room settling back into quiet, he realized that everything on his first day in America, from the bed to the meal to the book, had not been random. They were connected. They led to this. They were trying to tell him something he had been refusing to hear. He remembered the morning he arrived at camp. The smell of fried chicken still warm, the scent of baked bread lingering in his mind, a cook smiling and calling German prisoners son. He had been captured expecting cruelty and found generosity. He had been prepared for starvation and discovered abundance. And now, on his second morning in America, he was handed a Bible with an explanation that carried no religious agenda, no propaganda, no pressure. For peace, the American soldier had said. There was nothing in German propaganda that had ever prepared him for a moment like that. Wilhelm set the book down and stood. The scent of pine rose warm from the floor beneath his feet. A soft breeze slipped through the window, carrying the smell of damp earth and flour from the kitchen where breakfast fires were being lit. It was not the smell of war. It was the smell of life, something he had forgotten existed. He stepped outside. The morning spread a gentle golden light across the yard. Wind brushed against the barbed wire fence, making the metal tips glint silver. Farther out, the shadows of old live oaks stretched wide, laying cool patches on the ground. The battle inside him began right there, between two realities that could not coexist. In Germany, they told him America was starving. Yet here, American soldiers fed POWs chicken, potatoes, and warm bread. In Germany, they said America was barbaric. Yet here, American soldiers smiled and called him fellow, a word meant for a human being. In Germany, they said America was godless. Yet this morning, it was an American who placed a Bible in his hands, not to convert him, but to help him sleep. Each small truth was a stone pushed deeper into a widening crack, and stone by stone, the wall the Reich had built inside him began to crumble. Wilhelm looked around. The German prisoners were lining up for breakfast. No one was being shouted at. No one was being struck. One or two even smiled. Thin, trembling smiles as if they needed war's permission to feel joy. A guard called out, "Breakfast's ready. Coffee too." Coffee. A drink he had once assumed existed only in frontline myths about American troops. In Europe, even German officers rarely saw real coffee, and here, it was being served to prisoners. Wilhelm went still. He had been sent across an ocean to fight monsters, but in America, he found people. He could no longer turn his back on that truth. A passing MP flicked his Zippo. Click. The sound that had startled Wilhelm yesterday now felt like an ordinary rhythm of a nation not trembling in darkness. The guard nodded politely, without arrogance, without malice. Wilhelm returned the gesture. The smallest nod he had ever dared offer an American. Something softened inside him, something very small, but real. He stood there for a long moment, watching the sunlight catch the wire, watching the smoke rise from the kitchen, watching the live oak leaves shimmer in the morning breeze. Then he understood what was happening. They weren't trying to reform him. They weren't trying to prove anything. They weren't trying to win his heart with tricks. They were simply living the way they believed, that even an enemy deserved to be treated like a human being. And that broke something inside him far deeper than fear. Wilhelm drew a long breath, the smell of earth, flour, and morning air, then stepped toward the prisoner lineup forming at the mess hall. And at that moment, Wilhelm knew. Nazism told us America was a monster, but America defeated that lie. with something far more powerful than force. They defeated it with decency. Wilhelm stepped out of the barracks with the Bible in his hand, but the first thing that hit him wasn't the light. It was the smell. The smell of salt air still lingering from the wind that had rolled in from the coast the night before. The smell of bread baking in the kitchen. Fresh, soft like a home waiting for a son to return. The faint scent of disinfectant, so clean it made him feel unworthy, and beneath it all, the honest sweat of German prisoners around him, the old scent of war still clinging to them. Layers of smells stacked on top of one another, as if two opposing worlds were weaving themselves together in the very air he breathed. Wilhelm stopped to steady his breath, but the breath only grew more tangled as memories from the previous day surged back. Hot bacon, the rich smell of meat filling the mess hall, and the American guard laughing loudly as he talked about baseball. He had been prepared for starvation and walked into the smell of a feast. From the camp yard came the sound of kids playing somewhere in town, the crack of a bat, the patter of shoes running on dirt, sounds that were just normal. Mixed into it were the guards laughing, not camp enforcer laughter, but the casual chatter of men talking about last night's game, as if they were not watching enemies at all, but simply doing their morning shift in a peaceful place. Wilhelm felt his chest tighten. A train whistle echoed in the distance, a long, rising note that made him shiver, not from fear, but because it sounded like the morning of a nation still whole. In Germany, those sounds had vanished long ago. Bombs had swallowed them. Churches had been leveled. Harbors reduced to skeleton ports. Cities turned to rubble. But here, behind barbed wire, America breathed with the sounds of life. Wilhelm looked up unconsciously at the fence. Sunlight rested on each barbed wire catching light like threads of silver being stitched by the morning. It didn't look like a weapon. It didn't look like a threat. It simply shimmered. Beyond it rose the white steeples of the town church poking through the trees. On this side, beneath his feet, the live oak shade stretched wide, cool, calm, patient. Everything he saw contradicted everything he believed. He walked a few more steps. The ground beneath him was dry, warm with the rising sun, identical to the warmth of the hot water that had poured down his back during last night's shower, a sensation his body still refused to believe was real. The sheet he had left behind still held the imprint of his back, thin but clean, and the mattress, the cushion that dipped under his weight, still made him feel ashamed for having slept so well. He had been trained to fear pain, but he didn't know how to handle comfort. An MP walked past, flicking his Zippo. Click. The opening note of a day that felt nothing like war. Wilhelm watched the flame flare and vanish, realizing that sound had already become part of the morning rhythm inside this camp. The soldier nodded. Wilhelm nodded back. A small gesture, but it felt like speaking a new language, the language of respect. Wilhelm stood at the edge of the yard, watching the German prisoners line up for breakfast. Faces that had once been tense, wary, curled inward with fear, were now softening. Not because they trusted their captors, but because they no longer knew what to hate. He had been prepared for cruelty and found decency. He had been prepared for humiliation and found humanity. And that quiet kindness, unannounced, unperformed, made him tremble. Human beings lived by the things they believed, but Wilhelm knew he no longer believed the old things. He couldn't, not after yesterday, not after this morning. He tightened his grip on the Bible, as if it were the only anchor holding him steady amid the flood rising inside him. And in that moment, he understood. The Reich shaped our fear, but America is reshaping our hearts. A silent truth. A truth without guns. A truth harder to resist than anything he had ever known in war. Wilhelm stepped into the breakfast line knowing his heart was changing, but it wasn't until that moment, when something small happened in front of him, that he truly understood what America was. Something small. An ordinary moment no German officer had ever mentioned. A piece of life the Reich's propaganda would never dare acknowledge. And it started with a baseball glove. 2 prisoners ahead of Wilhelm stopped suddenly. An American MP bent down to pick something off the ground. A brown leather baseball glove, soft and worn, with a small tear mended by white thread. The guard blew the dust off the glove, turned toward the fence, and tossed it to a boy of about 13 standing just outside the wire. The boy caught it with both hands, smiled, and ran off. That was all. But Wilhelm's heart jolted as if pulled backward. In Germany, wartime children didn't have baseball gloves. They played with empty milk cans, spun shells into makeshift toys, ran through streets filled with rubble and the smell of fire. Here, an American boy played baseball beside a camp holding enemy soldiers, with a soft leather glove Wilhelm had never seen the likes of in his entire life. A game, a smile, innocence. They didn't know war, or they knew, but were not torn apart by it. That alone tilted Wilhelm's entire world off its axis. And the moment didn't end there. The MP turned back to the line of POWs, reached into his jacket pocket, and pulled out a stainless steel thermos of coffee. The thermos gleamed, solid and sturdy, with a blue and white striped cotton towel hanging from its handle. The same kind Wilhelm's mother used in Munich, only cleaner, newer. The guard unscrewed the lid, and steam rose into the morning air, the rich, dark scent of real coffee drifting over the yard. Then he smiled and said half-jokingly, "Cold morning, huh? Bet you boys could use something warm." Wilhelm heard it and felt something pinch sharply in his chest. In the German army, guards never shared food, not even kind words. But here, on an American morning, a guard stood sipping real coffee from a steel thermos, holding a clean cotton towel, and looking ready to share if the rules allowed it. He chewed slowly, and around him the other prisoners did the same, all silent, all trying to understand the impossible. Wilhelm couldn't take his eyes off the thermos. In Germany, everything had been rationed: thin soup, black bread, fake coffee made from burnt barley. In America, guards carried real coffee, in real steel containers, and treated it like an everyday thing. And that baseball glove, worn, soft, hand-stitched, told Wilhelm something thousands of Reich propaganda pamphlets had never managed to say. Here, children still get to be children. Then, the moment that shattered Wilhelm happened. An older prisoner began coughing violently. He braced himself on his knees, nearly collapsing. Wilhelm instinctively stepped back, because in the German army, the natural reaction was to get out of the way and avoid being struck. But the Americans did the opposite. The MP set his thermos down, stepped forward, grabbed the prisoner's shoulders, and steadied him. "You all right, sir?" "Sir." They called a German POW sir. Wilhelm couldn't stand steady anymore. Heat flooded his head like a fever. He had been prepared to face monsters. He found neighbors. He found fathers. He found men who treated enemies with dignity. And that small, distinctly American, utterly ordinary thing, shattered the last remaining piece of fear inside Wilhelm. As he stepped into the mess hall, Wilhelm whispered, not to anyone else, but to himself, "If kindness is this ordinary for them, then everything I believed was extraordinary in its wrongness. A baseball glove, a thermos of coffee, a single word, sir." These small things had snapped the spine of propaganda within him, more gently than any bomb ever could. As Wilhelm stepped into the breakfast line, he knew his heart was changing. But it wasn't until that moment right then that he truly understood something about America. It wasn't a grand lesson. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't anything the Reich had ever warned him about. It was the fading shadow of a baseball glove disappearing behind the fence. And after that moment, Wilhelm walked into the mess hall no longer with fear, but with a kind of curiosity he had never felt before. One day, earlier, he had walked in like an animal driven into a corner. Today, He stepped in like a man no longer certain he understood the world. As soon as he crossed the threshold, the smells hit him. Stronger, clearer, tugging at a memory he hadn't touched in years. The smell of bread baking, hot, soft, with a slight crispness on the crust where it had browned. The smell of bacon frying, crisp and smoky, rising in warm waves from steel trays. The smell of real coffee, brewed from beans that had never seen rationing or war. These smells wrapped around Wilhelm like an embrace from a language that needed no words. In Germany, morning smelled like gunpowder, sweat, and moldy black bread. Here, morning smelled like a family. He hated how much he missed it. A prisoner beside him whispered, "They're feeding us this again, every day?" Wilhelm didn't answer, because the truth was even more unsettling. They weren't just feeding them. They were feeding them well. They were feeding them as if it weren't remarkable at all. He felt that truth lodge in his throat. The sound in the mess hall was different, too. Not shouting, not boots hitting the floor, not metal slammed against tables, but the soft scrape of chairs, the gentle tap of spoons on trays, the muffled laughter of guards in the hallway, and the familiar click of a Zippo as a soldier lit his buddy's cigarette before shift change. An American morning had its own sound, soft, confident, the sound of a nation unafraid. Wilhelm sat on the wooden chair. It didn't wobble, didn't rot, wasn't damp. Beneath him, the clean floor shone so clearly he could see the faint reflection of his own hand in the polish, and when his fork touched the first strip of bacon, he stopped. His hands trembled, not from hunger, but from the emotion that came with the bite he was. An MP walked over, setting a water container near the barracks. He glanced at Wilhelm for a second and asked simply, "You good?" Not mocking, not commanding, just a normal question from one human being to another. Wilhelm nodded, though he wasn't sure if he truly was good. As the soldier walked away, Wilhelm understood something painfully honest. Americans didn't even think they were doing anything special. Treating prisoners kindly was simply the right thing to do. No philosophy, no agenda, no moral lecture, just a cultural instinct, and that made it harder for him to face than anything else. He sat on the dusty ground near the barracks, hands resting on his knees, eyes on his boots, dirty, worn, still carrying Sahara mud from the Tunisia front, the direct opposite of the polished boots of the American guards. In moments like this, Wilhelm realized that change didn't come from grand speeches or dramatic gestures. It came from the small things. A nod. Hand catching someone who's about to fall. A strip of bacon. A Bible placed quietly at dawn. A child playing baseball, unaware of hatred. Small things so gentle he couldn't defend against them. He wasn't being converted. He wasn't being broken. He was simply being shown a version of humanity he hadn't seen in years. And that felt truer than any propaganda he had ever heard. Wilhelm spoke softly, just enough for himself to hear. If this is the enemy, then maybe I've misunderstood my entire life. No music, no drama. Just a man sitting in the yard of an American camp, realizing that his hatred had nowhere left to hold on. Wilhelm had almost slipped into sleep when he heard a soft sound outside the barracks. Not loud, not urgent, just the quiet thump of something being placed gently on the wooden step. He sat up by instinct and moved to the window. In the thin moonlight, an American soldier was walking away from the barracks. He had left something small on the doorstep. A tin box. No one in the camp had asked for it. It wasn't part of any ration. It wasn't listed in any regulation. It was simply a spontaneous act. Wilhelm looked around. No one else had seen it. He opened the door, stepped out, and picked up the box. Inside was a piece of apple pie, still warm, wrapped in white wax paper, folded carefully so it wouldn't crumble. No note. No signature about to take. He had eaten food in America, but he had never allowed himself to enjoy it. Today. He wasn't sure he could resist anymore. Wilhelm took a small bite. Just one. But the moment the salt, the smoke, the crispness broke open in his mouth, time seemed to stop. Germany didn't have this taste. War didn't have this taste. Hatred didn't have this taste. He set the fork down, inhaled deeply, and felt his heartbeat stumble. Dizzy, unsteady. Not because the food was good, but because he realized he was letting America in. Not into his stomach, but into his beliefs. An American soldier walked past the tables, placing fresh water jugs on the rack. He glanced at the prisoners, nodded lightly, and said, "Breakfast's good today, huh?" No one answered, neither did Wilhelm. Not because of fear, but because his throat tightened with emotions he couldn't explain within the Reich's logic. He had been trained to see Americans as monsters, but monsters don't worry about feeding their prisoners. Monsters don't drink coffee beside the men they captured. Monsters don't treat their enemies like human beings. Wilhelm lowered his eyes to his tray, and for the first time, he ate without feeling guilty. When breakfast ended, a young prisoner whispered, "Maybe they want us dependent on them." Wilhelm shook his head. No, this wasn't control. This wasn't manipulation. This wasn't psychological warfare. This was how Americans lived, how they treated people, what they believed, and that terrified him more than any weapon ever had. As Wilhelm stepped out of the mess hall, he realized something simple, yet powerful enough to make him stop walking. He felt light. Not joyful, not happy, just no longer curled into himself the way he had been when he first stepped off the ship. And that lightness unsettled him. He turned back and glanced into the mess hall once more. The smell of bacon and bread baking still drifted through the air, clinging to his clothes as if he had just walked out of someone's kitchen. Not a prisoner of war camp. None of it made sense with the image he had been taught about America. Prisoners weren't supposed to eat like this. Prisoners weren't supposed to sleep like this. Prisoners weren't supposed to be treated like this. But he had experienced all of it, and that truth was forcing him to look inward. Across the camp yard, the prisoners stood in small clusters, speaking in cautious voices. No one laughed, no one breathed too deeply, no one allowed themselves to feel comfortable, even though nothing was actually threatening them. Wilhelm heard the familiar click of the guard's Zippo by the gate. Yesterday, that sound had made him flinch. Today, it was simply someone lighting a cigarette. "Why are you standing still like that?" a prisoner asked him. Wilhelm took several seconds to answer. "I don't know what we're supposed to think anymore." A child's laugh echoed from beyond the fence. The same boy from yesterday ran past again, this time holding a baseball. His father walked beside him, a newspaper tucked under his arm. They spoke casually. They didn't look at the camp. They weren't curious, as if the German POWs were just a group of strangers passing through, nothing more. Wilhelm watched them longer than he meant to, not because he was surprised, but because he realized he was jealous. In Germany, children didn't have mornings like this. No baseball, no laughter ringing down city streets, no time to be children. And suddenly, Wilhelm understood. America wasn't what he'd been told, because it had never lived through the collapse Germany had. He walked to the fence, placed a hand on the barbed wire. Cold, dry, but no longer frightening. One day earlier, even without being told, every man believed the other side of the fence was where the enemy waited for their chance. Today, he looked beyond it and saw life. Real, ordinary, uncalculated. Wilhelm inhaled deeply. The scent of salt air from the coast drifted in, mixing with the clean cotton still lingering on his shirt from last night's bedsheets. Everything was too clean, too calm, too different from the life he had known. He didn't know how to process any of it. No deeper message, just a piece of American pie in the night. Wilhelm stood frozen. Years of living on wartime rations made the pie feel foreign to the world he knew, too homelike, too ordinary, too kind to be sitting at the door of a man who once pointed a rifle at these very people. He lifted the slice. Warmth seeped through his fingers. the smell of apple, butter, and cinnamon mixed with the night wind. He took a small bite, just a bite, and immediately had to sit down on the step, as if his legs no longer knew how to support whatever emotion was rising inside him. In that moment, every layer of psychological armor he had built simply fell off on its own. He remembered the American who caught him when he slipped. He remembered the boy tossing the baseball behind the fence. He remembered the soft mattress, the clean cotton smell, the question, "You good?" the Bible offered in the morning, the eyes of people who did not see him as a monster, and tonight, the apple pie was the final drop in a cup already full. He understood he was no longer the soldier who stepped onto the Norfolk docks on day one. He couldn't be. A simple piece of pie had told him something the entire war never could, that America's everyday kindness, unperformed, uncalculated, simply itself, was stronger than any propaganda he had ever heard. Wilhelm tightened his grip on the tin box. Moonlight traced silver lines along the barbed wire. He stared at it and realized it no longer felt like a barrier, just a border between the world he once believed in and the world he was now living in. He spoke softly, almost whispering into the night. "No one ever told me America could be this gentle."